joining us, Finding God in the World of Video Games today. Today we're going to take a look at some of the challenges that many of us are experiencing right now in the world around us with everything that's going on, whether it's loss of employment and the finances that go with that. For many people, they're worried about their health, and I've had personally friends and family who have lost loved ones or are concerned about doing so. The list could go on and on and on. And in these tough times, it's very important that we take a look back for some precedent on how we can deal with some of these challenges and some direction for us to respond. Since this is Finding God in the World of Video Games, I think it's important that we maybe take a look there as well. You know, there's a saying that when the times get tough, tough get going, and I can't think of too many protagonists that were tougher than Aloy, the heroine of the game Horizon Zero Dawn.
And talk about a world in turmoil. Aloy finds herself in the challenging circumstance of facing a hostile environment full of giant robots, crazy enemy tribes, and homicidal artificial intelligence opponents. If you haven't tried it yet, now is definitely the time, because Aloy definitely has a story to tell and a lesson worth learning as well.
And, you know, oftentimes we see so many of these very heavily male-saturated storylines. You know, you got people like Master Chief and Kratos from God of War, and we kind of get accustomed to hearing their stories over and over and over again. But in this particular game, Aloy sets out to kind of shatter that glass ceiling that we've seen, where she tells a story of overcoming the loss and tragedy, personally as well as for her entire world, that would rival anything you saw in the story arc for Kratos and God of War. You know, and she does it without any of the snarling and anger management issues that he did. She didn't even have to paint herself all white. I don't want to spoil that story for you, but she's the star of this show for sure, dispatching giant robot dinosaurs and single-handedly just about finding out all the details on this conspiracy that plunged her world into this bizarre regression of tribal warfare.
Yeah, and I don't want to spoil the story for those who haven't played, but suffice to say that during her journey she is going to lose a lot of friends the hard way and have more than her fair share of rugs pulled out from underneath her in the process. Surviving her pandemic was just one task on her to-do list.
You know, so many of the stories that we hear from the Bible are much the same as these video game plot lines. You got larger-than-life male characters like Noah, Moses, King David, Samson, and others being used mightily by God to save their land, their countries, their people, and at times the entire planet from complete destruction. But there are also incredibly strong and determined women who refuse to be defined as just another damsel in distress, casting just as large of a shadow as they demonstrated how incredibly critical they are to the fulfillment of God's plan of salvation. Today we're going to take a look at one such woman who refused to be defined by what was in her history, what was in her bloodline, and all that she had lost, and instead seized hold of the destiny that the Lord had for her, a woman named Ruth.
The Book of Ruth has an interesting duality to it. The most obvious view is that of a tender Hallmark movie tale between a kind, generous man named Boaz and the completely down-on-her-luck Ruth. The only thing missing is the two of them opening up a coffee shop in a small town together as the credits roll.
I've seen like a dozen of those movies just over the Christmas season this last year. And starts snowing all over everybody in July because, you know, Hallmark. But we can also look at it through the lens of an analogy of the love story between God and his people. I know a lot of people like seeing that second level of meaning in this, and that's all well and good for everybody except for Ruth, because this is not a story for her. This was her real life. It was not romantic. It was not beautiful. It was just a lot of pain and loss. Ruth was not aware at the time that anyone would care about her story, that it would be captured in the Bible, that it would be a movie and all other forms of media. She simply was going through her sorrow, having no idea what it was going to mean in the end, that someday she would become part of the genealogical lineage of Jesus Christ himself. There's no way she could have predicted that from here. I mean, look at her origin. She's not a Jew. She was not part of the chosen race that came from Abraham. She was a Moabite woman. She has a very challenging bloodline if you want to look at it from the background perspective. I'm not going to get into too many details here because we may have a mixed audience, but I will say that she was the child of Lot and one of his daughters, and there's a whole different line here, a cursed line, honestly, that she is a descendant from.
But in a family tree that includes the prostitute Rahab, the child born of the adulterous relationship between David and Bathsheba, and now the widowed immigrant Ruth, the picture becomes even more clear that when God chose exactly how he would personally enter the world, he chose people who had experienced exceptional loss and lived to tell the tale.
We'll just summarize Ruth's story very quickly for the sake of time, but the patriarch of her family, her father-in-law, Elimelech, he passed away. And then both of his sons, one of whom Ruth was married to, then both of them passed away as well. So there's no men left in this family to save anyone here. It's just these three women, her mother-in-law, herself, and her sister-in-law, no means of providing for themselves in an era in which that was a very challenging position to be in. So Ruth is confronted with the decision here. She can continue to stay with her mother-in-law and try to make things work, or she could go back to her old life, her old people, and try to make something happen, find a new guy and start over from scratch. And if she had done that, if she had taken that easy path, she would have been written out of historical significance forever.
When the going gets tough, backtracking and abandoning those who need you is never a response that'll be rewarded. Ruth declines the easier road and decides to tough it out with her mother-in-law, Naomi, answering her with this beautiful and poetic statement of commitment. In Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, Ruth says, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me."
Ruth obviously had a very powerful way with words, and she convinced Naomi to let her travel with her to Bethlehem, where Naomi was headed, both of them now, to a very uncertain future as widows. And in their situation where they were going, there was obviously some precedent for how that should have been handled, but because of the death of her husband, the death of her brother-in-law, who should have been next in line to care for her, and then her father-in-law, who would have been responsible for caring for her as a daughter, the next person that they have, we see in Ruth chapter 2, verse 3, is a man named Boaz. And I find it humorous the way the Bible records it. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, as if there's ever any happenstance in the Bible. Clearly, God was directing her towards the one person who was in a position to redeem her. But this only would have occurred if all of those losses had happened first and she had hit this horrific rock bottom.
Yeah, and Boaz may have been a wonderful man, but let's keep it real. He was not coming to Moab to look for Ruth. To be fair, he had no way of checking Facebook to see if her relationship status had changed to widowed. He was simply living his life in blissful ignorance of the role he was about to play in things. If Ruth had stayed behind in Moab, she may have found a new husband in the process, but not her destiny. God has something far grander than a mere replacement in mind for her.
And through her steadfast faith in a God that was honestly based on faith that she hadn't even spoke to him or met him, she chose to believe in him. Even though he had allowed her to lose everything, she gained redemption not only for herself and her family, but she became grafted into the future redemption of the entire human race by becoming a human ancestor to Jesus Christ himself. Really consider that for a moment. Her loss was necessary to add her DNA to the solution for the sin problem that was afflicting all of humanity. She could have simply accepted that suffering on the sidelines and become a footnote in history just like her sister-in-law, and nobody writing any books about her, and nobody would blame her for that. But instead, Ruth became one of the few women in the entire Bible who has a whole book dedicated to telling her story. And without her story of exceptional loss, we wouldn't have had her to get us to the place where we have our Savior who redeemed us all. Simply because she made up her mind that she would not just take her ball and go home when the losses started piling up, but she put her full confidence in a God that she barely even knew.
So let's jump to the grand finale for Ruth. After what may be one of the most unique courtships in all of recorded history, we find Ruth and Boaz joining in marriage and sealing the lineage that would lead to King David and eventually to Jesus himself. The widow Ruth becomes one of the few women actually named in Christ's family tree. Check Matthew 1.
And if we take into consideration her origin as a Moabite in the first place, the truth is she started with a deck that was stacked against her in the first place. So whether you can relate to the loss of a spouse or a loved one, a significant relationship, maybe you felt like you started life from a cursed genealogy, or maybe you're just a member of the wrong family at the wrong time. From your view, don't worry, God has your future covered. Jesus was and still is the only person who has ever lived who got to choose exactly who his family members were prior to his birth. It was an intentional choice to make the world's redemption occur through those that honestly most of us would have probably just cast aside into life's damaged goods box. Your entire situation, much like Ruth's, may be part of a redemptive work not just for you, but for souls that may not exist for many, many years after we have come and gone. I can't even imagine Ruth's surprise at realizing the tragedy that happened to her in this very small corner of the world would have such an amazing ripple effect throughout all of history, and that she would become world-renowned for being a helpless widow who chose to put her faith in God. Your story may differ a little bit in the outcome, but you're not suffering on the sidelines without God's awareness. Her story of loss and pain ended up in total victory, not just for her, but for all of mankind. And if we choose to love and follow God with blind faith as Ruth did, we can have confidence knowing that all of these things will come together in the end to tell a story worth writing about that will one day inspire those who follow in our footsteps.